My name is Nassim Saabs.
So then I looked at, okay, well, where did all of these apocalyptic beliefs come from? And then you trace the origin of the Christian apocalyptic belief, the Jewish beliefs, even maybe the Islamic beliefs. And they all trace down to these angels and these entities that come from the sky and instill these beliefs in certain prophets, and then these prophets go out and get everybody very excited about them. So that's when I finally hit Sitchin and some of these books about the ancient astronauts, that these could be UFOs. At that point, I thought, this is getting pretty wild. Whoever these UFOs are, they are here deliberately instilling religious beliefs that easily trigger people into going to war with each other. And I was really on the fence about that because I started reading more of the UFO literature. A very common idea is that the UFOs are more benign. They're here to help us, but the reason they stay in the background is because we're so warlike, they don't want to risk being attacked. There's a reason for them staying in the background, which is more benign. I couldn't really decide which way is it. And then I thought, okay, what I'll do is I'll start exploring these apocalyptic eras in human history, when you have a lot of disease and these strange religious movements arise, or a lot of warfare, and see, are there UFO reports from those eras? And one of the biggest apocalyptic eras was the Black Death. It started in the 14th century, where at least half of Europe's population was wiped out during a relatively short period.
Let me just clarify for listeners that the Black Death, also known as bubonic plague and pneumonic plague, was 1347 to 1350, 4 years when all of this death occurred.
Yeah, it was just an incredible apocalyptic era. So I thought, okay, well, what I'll do is I'll just go see, were there any reports of unusual aerial activity during that time? I'll never forget it. I went to the UCLA Research Library, and they had like 2 or 3 books on it. The second book I looked at, I just was stunned because this author had just gone back and collected the stories that people were reporting of unusual phenomena connected to the Black Death.
And this is Johannes Knoll, and the book has a copyright date of 1926. It's entitled The Black Death, A Chronicle of the Plague.
Correct. I was flabbergasted. What people were reporting, well, they called them comets, but they were clearly not comets from the actual descriptions. These were bright flying objects, and they were said to be spraying gas. And this was a very common thing that happened from town to town, from region to region, where you have these gases being spread, and the people at that time said, well, these are the gases, well, they called them mists, actually, and that these mists were the cause of the Black Death. In many cases, they said that they came from these objects in the sky that were spraying them. The third phenomena, which I found very intriguing, was the Men in Black phenomena that were happening at that time, too, where in a number of the villages and towns, they would report that these human-like figures dressed in black would appear on the outskirts of a town, and they had these long instruments that they would kind of wave back and forth. And right after that, a plague would break out. Sometimes they reported these figures walking through a town with these long instruments, and right afterwards, the plague would break out in these towns. What I'll do is I'll start exploring these apocalyptic eras in human history, when you have a lot of disease and these strange religious movements arise, or a lot of warfare, and see, are there UFO reports from those eras? And one of the biggest apocalyptic eras was the Black Death. It started in the 14th century, where at least half of Europe's population was wiped out during a relatively short period.
Let me just clarify for listeners that the Black Death, also known as bubonic plague and pneumonic plague, was 1347 to 1350, 4 years when all of this death occurred.
Yeah, it was just an incredible apocalyptic era. So I thought, okay, well, what I'll do is I'll just go see, were there any reports of unusual aerial activity during that time? I'll never forget it. I went to the UCLA Research Library, and they had like 2 or 3 books on it. The second book I looked at, I just was stunned because this author had just gone back and collected the stories that people were reporting of unusual phenomena connected to the Black Death.
And this is Johannes Noel, and the book has a copyright date of 1926. It's entitled The Black Death, A Chronicle of the Plague.
Is the government poisoning our air, or are those jet streams in the sky harmless today? We expose the truth behind Chemtrails conspiracy. The word conspiracy comes from a Latin word meaning to breathe as one, but today on Off the Grid, we'll have to hold our breath until we get to the bottom of this counter-conspiracy on chemtrails. Let's go to my vigilant producer, Alex Logan, who has the rundown. But Alex, I want to say something first. When I did conspiracy theory for those 3 years on television where we did the 24 episodes or whatever it turned out to be, chemtrails, people always wanted to hear about them. They always wanted me to investigate them. And for some reason, it never made the cut. I didn't have full say-so on what did or didn't make the cut on the show. But chemtrails came up every year, and I found it interesting that we never did cover it, so I guess we'll do it now. Go ahead, Alex.
Well, what's your general impression of the chemtrail conspiracy, Governor? Do you think there's something there?
If they're truly putting chemicals in the air, aren't they breathing the same air? I mean, I don't see nobody walking around with gas masks on who are in the know. How do they avoid it?
Well, I actually brought my gas mask today, Governor, and later in the show we'll talk to climate scientist Captain Chemtrail Caldera. But let's start off with some fast facts about the chemtrails conspiracy. Conspiracy theorists believe that jet trails in the sky, commonly referred to as contrails, condensation trails, or vapor trails, are in fact chemtrails, chemical or biological agents sprayed by the government at high altitude for top secret reasons including mind control, population control, and weather control. In your research for American conspiracies, Governor, did you encounter anything about the government being able to control our weather?
Yeah, I did, through HAARP. They showed with HAARP that you, yes, indeed, can control and create clouds and do things like that with it. Maybe they're trying to control the weather with what they're doing up there, but to be poisoning us and to be putting things in the air that are ultimately going to harm us, aren't they likewise harming themselves? We all have to breathe that air.
Well, that's a good argument against it, and claims began in 1996 after an Air University research paper titled Weather as a Force Multiplier, Owning the Weather in 2025, suggested that the Air Force was conducting weather modification experiments. The purpose of the paper, part of a thesis to outline a strategy for the use of future weather modification systems to achieve military objectives, and according to the U.S. Air Force, does not reflect current military policy, practice, or capability. Do you support the government researching weather modification to fight our enemies, or is this a waste of money?
No, here's what you got. We studied that when we did HAARP, and the way I understand it best is this. We've all signed on to a treaty that we won't use the weather as a weapon for war internationally. But the loophole that they found is that it doesn't stop them from doing the experiments if they do it within your own country. You know, they're always going to find a loophole, remember that. Any type of agreement they sign, they will find some way to circumvent it. I'm certainly not naive enough to believe that our government and our military does not try to understand climate and climate control, because that could be a huge weapon in case of war.
Well, claims for the theory include the fact that some contrails from high-flying aircraft evaporate quickly, while others, which they believe to be chemtrails, persist and grow into expansive sheets of cirrus clouds. The appearance of grid patterns through the sky, and reported outbreaks of illness after the appearance of chemtrails. What could the US government really stand to gain from keeping us all sick?
Well, I don't know. And where has been an outbreak of illness? I mean, I've been all over the place and seen chemtrails in the sky, and I've never gotten sick. I've even seen them off the grid, and I don't get sick.
Well, Randall Martin, an atmospheric scientist at Dalhousie University, says, I'm involved in a large number of experiments. We measure the suite of pollutants in the atmosphere down to the trillionth of a millimeter. If an aircraft were intentionally polluting, we would notice it. So call me a skeptic, but this one doesn't seem to have a leg to stand on. Jesse, are you buying any part of this chemtrails conspiracy?
Like I said, I do it from a very, very position of basic common sense. Why would they commit suicide themselves and put things in the air that they themselves or their loved ones could be harmed from? I can't imagine that. But then again, I suppose man will never cease to amaze me.
Well, now let's change gears and invite on an expert on geoengineering and chemtrails.
Ken Caldera. He's a climate scientist for Carnegie Institute of Science at Stanford University, and one of the first scientists to seriously explore the feasibility of proposing geoengineering techniques or scientific methods of manipulating climate. Chemical terrorists have dubbed him Captain Chemtrail, claiming he's been helping the government conduct cloud brightening experiments for years, as evidenced by streaks in the sky. I'd like to welcome Ken to Off the Grid. Ken, you got quite a resume. Now, I have to confess that I only took Sam Halloran's chemistry class in high school at Roosevelt in South Minneapolis many years ago, but I do live by common sense. And how do you end up with a name like Captain Chemtrail?
Well, it's a pretty tough thing to figure out how people draw that together. I guess there are dots. And, just the way the ancient Greeks saw stars in the sky and managed to see whole constellations, and people see a few dots and they draw a correlation in their mind that, isn't any more there than the constellations are in the sky.
I can take to the bank that there's no such thing as chemtrails, that they're not putting anything out there in the sky out of the ordinary, just burning fuel and flying people around.
There's a lot more jet travel now than there was a few decades ago, and so people are seeing a lot more contrails, and people are imagining these contrails are some secret geoengineering program, but, it's just ordinary jets flying around, falling down. Scientists would write it up and put it into major journals, and the only people writing about these things are fringe people who are not in major journals. And then you have, I believe, there's a conspiracy to keep this out of the literature.
All right, then explain this to me then. Can't these scientists, though, haven't they been bought in by who they work for? I've always heard that they get hired by specific, if you're hired by the petroleum industry, if you're hired by whoever, you're going to give, in other words, you're going to, I guess for lack of term, you're going to give us a Warren Commission. You're going to have the answer, and then you're only going to seek what leads to that answer. That doesn't go on in that world of scientific. They can't be bought.
Well, I agree with your basic point that human psychology is such that we often tend to see things in our own self-interest as being right. But I think there are enough diversity of scientists and working in universities and so on. And I can tell you, if you could prove that there was some secret government program going on and you had all the data, that you would become a famous scientist. And so I think maybe if you're working for Monsanto or something, it wouldn't help you. But if you're working for a university or, like I am, Carnegie Institution, it would be a big feather in your cap if you could show that there was this vast conspiracy going on.
Well, Ken, thank you very much. I appreciate it for coming on Off the Grid. It's nice to talk with someone that has your credentials.
What do you think about all the aerial spraying that we're seeing in the skies, Mr. Stu?
Chemtrails.
Chemtrails.
Yeah.
What is your opinion of chemtrails?
I have no opinion.
Do you not see the aerial spraying in the sky? Going from,
I know. I know what you guys
you
are about.
realize
Look, I'm not an expert in everything, right? You guys have your own.
We'll have some free information for you. Take a look at it. Because as a scientist, you should be aware of these things. Surely.
I know.
So obvious in the environment, so it exists, right?
Are you
I
on
got caught up
chemtrails?
in my steel, and this was actually for cross that out. And then I can tell you.
I would really like you to look at that.
I've heard your message. Chemtrail guys dog me all the time. Okay?
You're not
The
seeing
minute